There it is.
He scores!
Bingo!
The Red Wings win! Scores! Peter Forsberg has done it again! McCarty and Lemieux. And look who came all the way out to try to help. Patrick Waugh.
And the Washington Capitals
Scores! Andy McDonald! Raymond Moore! And Marty Brodeur is the winningest goaltender in the NHL. A sweep for the New Jersey Devils, and the moment is at hand for the presentations of the Stanley Cup.
Believe it or not, two events took place that helped fuse the rivalry, and both happened before the Avs even existed. The Devils won the 1995 Stanley Cup, sweeping the Detroit Red Wings, and ironically, when the Conn Smythe came out, Claude Lemieux was announced the winner. Lemieux was known for his gritty play and was hated by many. The star wouldn't stay in New Jersey afterwards, however, as a three-team trade would find Lemieux in the newly formed Colorado Avalanche. Interestingly enough, he went to a team who just departed from Quebec stars such as Joe Sakic and Peter Forsberg into a team that was almost nicknamed the Rocky Mountain Extreme. He was one of two key acquisitions that made the newly formed Avalanche a legit threat.
Mario Tremblay just said something to Patrick Waugh. Patrick Waugh leaned over and spoke to the president of the Canadiens organization. But that's going to draw some questions after this hockey game.
Earlier that season, the Red Wings would face off against Patrick Waugh and his Montreal Canadiens, and the Wings showcased just how dominant of a team they were, as they smoked Waugh, tallying 9 goals before he was finally pulled. Obviously, he wasn't happy, but he went to the Canadiens' owner and stated it was his last game in Montreal. A few days later, he was shipped off to the newly formed Avalanche, and in their first season, the Avs would make some noise. The Avs would make the playoffs, eventually beating both Vancouver and Chicago to make it to the Western Conference Final, where they'd face off against, guess who? The Red Wings. Already, these two teams had some history, and as of now, all seem to be going fine, until Game 3. At this point, the Avs have won 2 straight, and the Wings were hoping to make this a series. All seemed to be going okay, until Kozlov smashed Foot's face into the glass. Lemieux would seek revenge, and then elbowed Kozlov from behind. This would cause Lemieux to be suspended for Game 4, along with a $1,000 fine to go with it. Games 4 and 5 would go underway, and headed into Game 6, the Avs would possess a 3-2 series lead, and needed just one win to move on. This game would spark the vicious feud between the two teams, as Claude Lemieux pounded an innocent Chris Draper against the boards, causing Draper to face multiple fractures in his face. None of the players on either team saw what damage had been done until the game was over. The Avs would win the game and the series, and it didn't help when Lemieux refused to apologize to Draper after the hit, and had to shake the guy's hand.
I can't believe I shook this guy's friggin' hand after the game. That pisses me right off.
Lemieux would get fined and suspended once again, but it wasn't good enough for Detroit. To add even more salt to the wound, the Avalanche would end up sweeping the Panthers in the Stanley Cup final, eventually winning their first Stanley Cup in franchise history, in their first year as the Avalanche. The following season, Detroit was making moves to try to compete with their new foe, while the Avs were hoping to continue their dominance. Claude Lemieux ended up getting hurt and would miss the first 2 regular season games against the Red Wings, but when he made his return against Detroit, it wasn't really all that hyped up. Lemieux and Draper exchanged some words, but a sorry of sorts still was never said. The gloves stayed on, and that was that. But it was when they were in Detroit where all hell broke loose. Beforehand, some minor fights took place, including Larionov of all people getting involved, but the biggest brawl began towards the end of the first period, where Red Wings' Darren McCarty saw Lemieux standing alone, and it was then that the all-out bloodbath began. Everyone seemed to be involved, but one of the most memorable moments of this rivalry was when the goaltender Patrick Waugh stepped out of his crease to join the brawl and actually fought Detroit's goaltender Mike Vernon. Also, to add fuel to the fire, McCarthy kneed Lemieux in the head along the boards. Believe it or not, this was only the beginning. Deadmarsh would take on Konstantinov, Shanahan and Foote went at it, and eventually the two teams realized that an actual game was taking place and the score would be deadlocked at 5 apiece. Until Darren McCarthy, of all people, scored the game winner, adding salt into the Avalanche's wound. By now, this rivalry was heated up, and to make the fire ignite even more, after the game, Red Wings coach Scotty Bowman had some words of his own.
It happened again, but, and I don't think any player in the league is trying to injure another one. But all we needed, all could all been put away, if you would have said, he's sorry.
Another Western Conference final matchup between the two teams occurred months later, and Detroit was hoping to beat their kryptonite. Game 4 highlighted the series as another battle occurred, which even included the coaches, as Avs coach Mark Crawford went at it with Bowman in an all-out shouting war. More fights took place as well, and at the end of the day, the Wings would ultimately get their revenge and match their rivals at 1 cup apiece as they went on to sweep Philadelphia in the Stanley Cup final. The 97-98 season would be a sudden drop-off of the rivalry, but not until each team got their definition of getting even. Lemieux decided to challenge McCarthy again, but it was a failed attempt at trying to end the beef. But when the teams met in April, basically a sequel of what they call Bloody Wednesday took place. We had another all-out brawl, and we had another goalie fight between Patrick Waugh and this time Chris Osgood. This game alone had over 200 penalty minutes. However, it was at this point that some realized this rivalry has gone too far, including Waugh, who in an interview with Osgood years later stated, quote, "After our fight is when I realized this is overboard. This is not what we were there to do," while also mentioning that a shift in momentum occurred, and that eventually the teams grew a mutual respect for one another. The Wings would take home their second cup of the rivalry after the Avs wouldn't even make the second round, and by now, both teams knew what it took to win, and it showed. And once Lemieux was shipped back to New Jersey for never apologizing to Draper, both teams would mature and embrace a winning culture. They focused on the cup, and it paid off. The Avs would beat the Wings twice in 2 years, and ended up winning their second Stanley Cup, giving each team 2 to their name, and finally getting Ray Bourque a Stanley Cup. The Wings would go on to beat the Avs a year later and win another cup, making it a 3-2 edge. These two teams were deadly, but also extremely talented. Despite all that happened between the two foes, they were able to talk smack, destroy, and fight, all while dominating the Western Conference and the league for just over a decade. When the two teams faced off in the alumni game years later, the hatred between the two teams officially ended. Lemieux and Draper finally talked things over, and they both settled their differences, and the two teams learned to just respect one another for being great players. Waugh would go on to actually coach the Avs after retirement, and the Wings' Osgood would have one last hurrah, winning the cup in 2008. But by then, the Avs were on their way out of contention. This rivalry was one of the best in sports, two outstandingly talented teams filled with legends and Hall of Famers duking it out to see who could be the most dominant of the two. Between all the fights, chirps, memorable moments, and even death threats, in the end of the day, Joe Sakic was right. He summarized the entire timeline in one interview in '97.
Especially when you have two teams like ours that are pretty even, and two teams don't like each other, so it's going to be a great series.
These two teams changed hockey forever, and it's the last true rivalry the league's had. It's amazing how one hit can spark a decade-long hatred that'll be remembered by sports fans across the world. This is a moment, one that will forever go down in hockey history.
You're talking about, probably anywhere from 15 Hall of Famers on both organizations. That's how good both teams were.
I think none of us wanted to give an edge to the other. None of us wanted to go on a losing streak and say, hey, we got them now. We got the momentum.